Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And I have a new friend and neighbor. Peter Grinspoon, MD, is a primary care doctor at Massachusetts General Hospital. And he's also an instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School. And you've been a cannabis specialist for 25 years. Dr. Grinspoon is a popular speaker, is frequently featured in national media on issues such as cannabis, addiction, and physician health. And his private practice offers a comprehensive cannabis coaching and education, as well as certification in Massachusetts. Dr. Grinspoon's also certified as a health and life coach in order to help people further their goals and follow their dreams. He offers comprehensive health and wellness coaching on a wide variety of issues for which he is uniquely qualified to help. And you have a new book, which I read, Seeing Through the Smoke. An expert doctor untangles the truth about cannabis. I learned a lot reading this book, and I thought I knew a lot about cannabis and marijuana, but I learned a lot from you, Peter. And before we get into it together, I want to just say your father was a pioneer of cannabis, and I bought a copy of his book that came out in 1971, Marijuana Reconsidered, and it was incredibly controversial but well received. And you have a personal story with your brother that I'd like you to share, because for me, this really, challenged the Nixon narrative that, pot is a gateway drug that's so horrible, on and on and on. We can get into that. But before I ask you to speak, I also want to reference another book that I read of yours called Free Refills. A doctor confronts his addiction, which is fascinating. And but this is the one that I want to focus on today, and we can do a follow-up one, but we'll have a free-flowing conversation. And lastly, we were planning to do this a few weeks ago, and you had a very unfortunate, horrible accident walking across Washington Street to the ice cream place, and somebody without lights on hit you and tragically, put you in the hospital with surgical needs, with breaking your leg, and which you're recovering. So I'm very grateful we're finally doing this. And I think there's a huge amount of interest, and people need to be educated about what you've spent your lifetime learning about. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. It's a real pleasure. We've been having a lot of great conversations recently, and it's fun to do it in a more sort of formal manner.
Yeah. So can we start with your family history and what moved your father, as a Harvard psychiatrist, to risk so much to write a book saying, you know what, let's reconsider marijuana?
Well, I think my dad just had a lot of intellectual integrity. And as he used to tell it, he passed away a couple years ago, peacefully at the age of 92. But, it was the late 1960s, and he was thinking, what are all these young people doing smoking marijuana? They're going to harm themselves. That was the dominant narrative from the U.S. government. That was the dominant narrative from the American psychiatric community, which there was no separation between them and what the U.S. government was saying. It's really kind of sad. And my dad did a very, very, very deep dive. And what he realized is that marijuana or cannabis does have potential harms. Teenagers shouldn't be using it. Pregnant, breastfeeding women, we don't have any idea if it's safe. It can destabilize people who have a history of psychosis. But he came to the conclusion in 1971, right when Richard Nixon was starting his war on drugs, that the criminalization of cannabis was profoundly more damaging to the youth, to the people who might be using marijuana, to our society in general, than the actual marijuana was. So he came out in 1971. Again, at this time, only 12% of Americans believed in legalization of marijuana. Now it's about 69%. It went up about a point for each of the 50 years that my dad toiled away on it. And his book was so controversial. He was getting like death threats, but at the same time, it was reviewed on the front page of the New York Times Book Review. It was a bestseller. It definitely made a splash. We could say that. And it really provided as you alluded to earlier, an intellectual counterweight to the narrative about marijuana, which was completely misleading. That we now know, well, we knew back then, but most of the doctors were really on the wrong side of the war on drugs, which is a whole nother topic. But my dad was very brave and courageous. And, it's very fun to watch, like, him convince our society that cannabis was okay and should be legal over the last 50 years. I've witnessed this, as you alluded to as well, my entire life. I've had a front row seat to the legalization movement, and it's been very, very interesting.
Yeah, and if you don't mind sharing personally, you had a brother who was suffering greatly with leukemia, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, my brother was dying from leukemia. He had acute lymphocytic leukemia. Right now, today, we cure 98% of the kids, 99% with this. But back then, they just didn't have enough different chemotherapy regimens, and it kept getting resistant to the chemotherapy. So my brother, Danny, who was older than me, he was like 16 and I was like 8, was fighting this unsuccessful battle with leukemia. And my parents had heard, obviously, because of my dad's research and connections, that cannabis can really help alleviate the chemotherapy, the nausea, the vomiting, the weight loss. So they illegally bought cannabis. My mom went to their high school, Wellesley High School, where we grew up, and bought cannabis from a friend. I write about that in my book, Seeing Through the Smoke. And when Danny wasn't using cannabis, he was lying in his bed throwing up. And when he used cannabis, he could eat, he could hold down food, he could strum on his Fender Stratocaster. And most importantly to me, he could play with his little boisterous little brothers instead of lying in his room. So I came to associate from a very early age the smell of cannabis with, first of all, my brother feeling and getting better. And second of all, we had a lot of legalization proponents in our house, some very prominent people like the Allen Ginsbergs and the Carl Sagans, and a lot of, just regular academics and scholars and teachers and professors. And they were always laughing and coming up with these great ideas to the world's problems, really thinking about things and really trying to change things for the better. And, at school, you go and there's like the DARE program. They're like, marijuana makes you amotivational. And then at home, I'm exposed to the most motivational people you'd ever meet. So again, from an early age, I associated the smell of marijuana smoke with healing and with intellectual energy and with idealism and with humor. I really had a different exposure than many other people did.
And Carl Sagan was included in your father's 1971 as what? Dr. X?
Mr. X, because Carl Sagan got a lot of grants from NASA, and they would have gone right away if he said, I'm Carl Sagan and cannabis helps my creative process, and this is how it helps. So he was Mr. X. And when he passed away, I believe in the early 1990s, my dad spilled the beans that Mr. X was Carl Sagan. And they managed to keep that secret for 30 years.
Right. But what was it like growing up with having all these luminaries hanging out in your living room? It must have been extraordinary.
Well, I was a kid, so I was always listening from the periphery, trying not to get noticed. So my dad wouldn't send me up to bed. And the conversations were absolutely fascinating. They were about, nuclear war was a huge topic because, this was the 1970s and the 1980s, the Soviet Union, the Cold War, hunger, how humanity is going to survive. Carl Sagan would come up with these theories of maybe the reason we haven't seen life in other galaxies yet is because when you reach a certain technological level, you blow yourselves up. I mean, hopefully that's not true, but those are the kind of concepts I was exposed to as a kid and as a preteen and as a teen. And it really made me think about things, and it really made me read everything I could get my hands on. I mean, again, the cannabis and the way it was used in my household was this spark to motivation. And it was so bizarre to go to the DARE project and have them tell you that it makes you amotivational. And I just knew they were lying. And it doesn't do wonders for your respect for authority to go in and have the police officers sitting there and that they're lying to you. It made me sort of a rebellious teenager.
Right. And you tell the story in Seeing Through the Smoke about Nixon commissioning a panel to research. Share that story.
Oh, yeah. Nixon commissioned a panel. He was hoping that his panel would say cannabis is evil, it's bad, it causes, low motivation, sperm count to drop, blah, blah, blah. And his panel actually, the Schaefer Commission came in and said, this drug isn't, it said a lot, very similar to what my dad said in his book. It has its potential harms. There are certain people who should use with extreme caution, if at all. But generally speaking, it is relatively safe compared to a lot of the other stuff that we use, and should be not only, it should be decriminalized. And Nixon just flat out said, I know I commissioned a panel of experts. I've read the report, and I'm going to make the executive decision to say the exact opposite and to do the exact opposite. It was such a fail, but the commission did give a lot of hope, intellectual firepower, and sustenance to the legalization movement, even if Nixon ignored it.
Yes, and Nixon, bad actor.
Nixon loved my dad, by the way. I have a daily briefing from Nixon that has about my dad's book, Marijuana Reconsidered. Mm-hmm. And my dad's name is circled, and it says H, which means Haldeman. H, I'm sure I remember this guy. This clown is far to the left. So Nixon actually called my dad a clown, which my dad wore as a badge of honor.
Yeah, so let's move on, because there's so much to cover. And here in Massachusetts, medical marijuana is now licensed, and different states are decriminalizing marijuana as well as legalizing marijuana. And I believe a few states with psilocybin as well. There's an incredible amount of research into psychedelic applications to help victims of trauma. Went to the American Psychiatric Association. I was astounded at how many presentations there was on that. So I really want you to tell my listeners what you think they need to know about, the time we're living in, and the benefits, and, the cautionary things, and why you're a consultant and people can ask you about their specifics.
Absolutely. Now, let's start with cannabis. Cannabis is a helpful tool in my toolbox as a primary care doctor. It doesn't help everybody. Some people have a bad reaction to it, and some people just don't like it. But that's true for all of the other medications that I have. The good thing about cannabis is that you can't die from it. Nobody has a fatal overdose. If I give you penicillin for your strep throat, you literally could die. So I actually feel less anxious prescribing cannabis than I do many of these other pharmaceuticals. Mm-hmm. It most commonly helps people with chronic pain, insomnia, and anxiety, but there are a million other uses, colitis, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome. But again, the key to it is to really start low and to go slow. People go to a dispensary and they'll get someone will upsell them a huge, really powerful gummy or a drink. And what happens if you take too much cannabis is you have a very, very anxious reaction. You don't die, but it's absolutely miserable. So for anybody just starting cannabis, or for people that are new to cannabis after 30 to 40 years, I can't tell you how many boomers I know who took the same 3 bong hits that they took in college. But the problem is the marijuana now is like 22%. THC, the active ingredient, where back then it was like 3%. So the 3 bong hits they take is like taking 20 bong hits, and then they freak out. So just take 1 puff, just take a quarter of a gummy, get started really slowly. And as I mentioned before, we don't recommend cannabis for teenagers. I mean, my brother,
I'm
they're dying.
You're repeating that. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, they're my brother Danny, and they're dying of cancer. Like, they're dying. Let them have some cannabis. But or also autism is an interesting, mostly with CBD, the non-psychoactive component. But if there's not a compelling indication, we say to teenagers, just say wait. We want you to wait at least until you're 18. And the reason is that there's pretty good evidence the cannabis can affect the developing brain. And most teenagers don't want to hurt their brains. They'll try cannabis, sure, it's not going to hurt them to try it, but we don't want them to be regular users at all until they're 18. And again, I don't recommend that they try it, but just understanding the nature of teenagers. Like, if you say, don't try this, the first thing you're going to do is try this. And they're
going to be influenced by peers more than what doctors or parents say anyway.
Absolutely. Though, interestingly, with legalization, the prohibitionists were concerned and were arguing that teenage use would go up, but actually teenage use has been stable or has been going down since legalization. And we don't know if that's because, a drug dealer will sell it to anybody, whereas at the dispensaries, if you don't have a ID, you're not even getting in the door. Or if it's just seeing grandma on the couch taking a toke or two for her rheumatoid arthritis just makes it that much less cool. It's not exciting thing if grandma's doing it, so we don't know why. But So teenagers shouldn't use it. And we don't know that it's safe in pregnancy and breastfeeding. And a lot of pregnant women are using it. It's very effective for nausea, for morning sickness, but that doesn't mean it's safe. But, at the other hand, the other things we use aren't particularly safe either. So we just need to do a lot more research. But the problem is you can't really do research on pregnant women, like give 1,000 cannabis, give 1,000 a placebo and see if there are birth defects. Like that's an unethical. So, and then people with a history of a mental illness have to be very careful. People with a history of psychosis, because it could destabilize people. But aside from that, I'm happy to try it in my primary care clinic or in my private practice. And again, a lot of people find benefit. Not everybody, but a lot of people do.
Great. And I watched a CNN documentary that Sanjay Gupta did. I think it was a CNN Anderson Cooper thing on Israel and older people and the dispensaries. And I didn't know that it was actually an Israeli researcher who first identified. Am I remembering correctly, THC?
Absolutely. Raphael Mechulam was an Israeli chemist who decided to study marijuana. No one else was studying it. You couldn't really study it in the United States because of, very, very strictly controlled. This was even before Nixon. This was like in the 1950s. It was like the Boggs Act. Like if you got caught with marijuana, you can go to prison for 10 years. Nobody was studying it here. And he discovered THC. And he, like my dad, was like the Energizer Bunny. He worked on this for like 60, 70 years. He passed away about a year ago. He was wonderful, but he discovered the active ingredient of marijuana, which is THC. And they also discovered a whole set of neurotransmitters and receptors in our body called the endocannabinoid system, which is incredibly important. It's sort of like our adrenaline system or our nicotinic system. Or there's a million different neurotransmitter systems. And this one in particular controls all of the other ones. It controls temperature, feeding, hunger, reproduction, memory. And unfortunately, they're not teaching it in most American medical schools. Israel is on fire with its medical cannabis research. A lot of other countries are too, and we've just got to catch up with them. It's a little bit embarrassing. We're not even teaching our doctors about, even if you don't like cannabis or you think it's not a medicine, you should understand the endocannabinoid system because it's critical to our physiology. And it's also, how can you understand cannabis if you don't understand how the receptors work? We don't understand adrenaline if we don't understand the epinephrine system. So we have a lot of work to do.
I want you to share some of your knowledge with my listeners. There are two types of cannabis, one that's more arousing for certain people and more anxiety reducing. What are the names?
Yep, there's indica, which is the relaxing type. Indicouch, you're just, very good for pain, good for anxiety, but it doesn't make you particularly energetic. And then there's like sativa, which makes people up and energetic. You clean your house, you go out to a party, or, it's interesting. Those were originally botanical differences because the sativas, the ones that make you up and energetic, are very tall plants. And the indicas are these short, scrubby plants. But during the Reagan's war on drugs, they would go over with helicopters and infrared sensors. And it became much too dangerous to grow the sativas for the outdoor growers. They'd all get arrested. So they hybridized the sativas and the indicas. So you could have the best of both and they wouldn't be as tall and you couldn't see them be seen. You could grow them without being snooped on from above. So most of what we get is actually a mixture of indica and sativa because of Reagan's helicopters. But generally speaking, if you ask for something, an indica, it denotes, even though we still don't have the botanical definition because they've been hybridized, an indica denotes something that will help you relax and help you with pain. And a sativa is something that might help someone who has ADHD, who really wants to focus or be up or accomplish a lot of things.
Yep. But I think we've reached a point now where we need to look at the science and we need to have really grounded approach. And that's why your consulting work is so valuable because you have this deep knowledge, and I highly recommend physicians read your book. But talk more about the different types of non-THC cannabinol effects and how they can be useful.
There are 4 million official medical marijuana patients in the United States. And many, many more people just buy it recreationally and use it. And they've done polls of recreational dispensaries. People going, and 2/3 of them will say they use it for pain. 3/4 will say they use it for sleep. So I think that the other thing I want to mention is that, recreational marijuana is still sort of being debated in this country. 2/3 are in favor, more than half of Republicans are in favor, but not everybody. 94% of Americans, literally 94%, support legal access to medical marijuana. So unless your enemies are in the 6% who don't approve of it, I think that you're not going to get attacked. Exactly. So, but it is interesting. As you alluded to, cannabis is a plant with 500 different molecules in it, many of which are, affect our brain or psychoactive, have an effect. So that's why there are different strains. We talked about the sativas and the indicas, but it also points to a lot of what are called minor cannabinoids. The major cannabinoids are THC, the one that gets you high, and CBD, which is the one that 1 in 7 Americans are taking. People generally know what CBD is, but CBD helps with chronic pain, with anxiety, with insomnia, and it doesn't give you a high. So for the people that don't like the high, which is a lot of people, CBD could be really, really effective. Or you use mostly CBD and add a little bit of THC in, and then the people can get relief from their insomnia, from their pain, from their anxiety, without becoming impaired. I also want to say CBD is very good for public speaking. A lot of people find public speaking like one of the most terrifying things that they could possibly happen to them.
One of the most common phobias. Yeah,
exactly.
For sure.
They did a study with CBD and it really helped people before public speaking. And, what a lot of people do before public speaking is take a beta blocker like propranolol, but that can make you a little bit sleepy and dull. If I were worried about public speaking, I'd definitely pick the CBD. And it helps with childhood epilepsy. It's an FDA-approved drug, Pulidex, to help alleviate childhood epilepsy, which is also very funny that the U.S. government is still maintaining that cannabis has no medical utility, but FDA has approved several cannabis-based drugs. THC is legal too, and Marinol for nausea and for weight loss. CBD is also very interesting for addiction. There are animal studies and a few human studies, very good animal data for addiction to amphetamines like cocaine and methamphetamine. And in humans, there's some studies for cannabis addiction, because I forgot to mention a certain portion of people do get addicted to cannabis. It's been very much exaggerated by the U.S. government. It's been very much exaggerated by the psychiatric community. I just write a lot in my book about why they're so off on cannabis. They completely missed the mark. They define cannabis addiction way too broadly, but in fact, a certain 3 to 5% will get addicted, and they need to be treated with empathy and compassion like people with any other addiction need to be. So that's another, while we're talking about the benefits and the harms, it's important to mention.
Yeah, I can't help but just insert Big Pharma makes a fortune with their drugs, and they don't want cheap alternatives that people can medicate. And, they have a business and they want a monopoly.
Oh, you're absolutely right. On every single state level ballot initiative, Big Pharma's donated very heavily on the let's keep cannabis illegal side of the equation. Like in New Mexico, there was Insys. That was a company that got in trouble for giving doctors kickbacks for selling fentanyl lollipops. But they're not a good company, but they donated $500,000 against legalization, yet they were designing their own cannabis-based drugs because they're learning about the endocannabinoid system. So the Big Pharma had this vision of cannabis being illegal, yet you have to buy drugs that basically do what cannabis does for tons of money. And they are losing. Yeah. We're winning the legalization battle. I could tell you that after watching it for 57 years, which is how old I am.
Yeah.
But, interesting thing, the last thing I'll say is that they're taking if you can't beat them, join them attitude. And same with the alcohol companies. Alcohol found cannabis to be a very serious threat. It is a threat to alcohol. People transition, and it's less dangerous and, in my opinion, much more interesting and fun. And less fattening, but so both the alcohol industry and the pharma industry are taking and the tobacco industry are taking if you can't beat them, join them. So they're merging, they're trying to take over, they're buying in, and there's a lot of concern about the cannabis industry. Like, who's going to be running it? Is it going to be the little guy, the local grower, or are we just going to have Budweiser version of cannabis, which nobody really wants?
Right. And I also want to just add, in terms of the forces that I think are responsible for for keeping it illegal and to give it a bad name, the privatization of our prison systems to send especially minority people in huge numbers to jail for long periods of time because they have a joint or...
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. I have a whole chapter in my book on the war on cannabis users. We've had, first of all, blacks and whites use cannabis at the same rate. And blacks have been arrested 4 times as often as whites. And getting arrested can mean going to prison, but even if you're not going to prison, it can affect your student loans, your education, your housing, your employment. And we've had 20 million, more than 20 million arrests for nonviolent cannabis possession in the last 50 years. I mean, this is causing generational poverty to many communities that have been targeted. And, that's why a lot of the talk around legalization doesn't just swirl around, let's make it legal so you don't get in trouble. A lot of it also includes trying to expunge some of those criminal records so that these people can go back to having normal lives, and trying to funnel some of the wealth and some of the prosperity that the cannabis industry is like in the tens of billions of dollars, and it's going to just keep growing, funnel some of that wealth back to these communities that have been devastated. So there's a lot of talk about reparations and about expungements and about social justice and equity. And it's really, really important that we pay attention to that stuff, because it's really wrong what's been perpetrated upon cannabis users.
Yeah, great. It's so important. And so what I want to push you a little bit, if I may, and say, because you've been consulting with people who come with problems, like what are some of the things that doctors need to think about, and what are some of the like dual diagnosis, or what are the indicators? Because you say clearly in your book, some people really do get addicted and it really is a problem. You talk about, throwing up as an issue and how to discern what's causing it, and especially if it's a person who's on other medications. So share a little bit of how you think about when people are coming. Hey, doc, what do I do?
Right. Well, that was actually about 6 questions.
Sorry, go for it.
Just
in
to tackle
whatever order you want.
No problem. Just to tackle the vomiting part. Cannabis is wonderful for people who have nausea and vomiting, people with chemotherapy, pregnant women, which is why so many use it, even though I think they shouldn't necessarily be using it there's not really much that's safer. But if you use it heavily on a daily basis, you could have a paradoxical reaction. People have a paradoxical reaction, which means like the opposite occurs. Like most people, Benadryl makes sleepy, but 0.5%, it makes like wire. They just have the opposite reaction. The receptor works in the opposite way. And if you use cannabis very heavily, you can develop something called cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, which means you're barfing uncontrollably and you have to be overnight in the hospital to get hydrated. And it's really, really ugly. If you're in the emergency department and someone comes in and they use cannabis and they're throwing up uncontrollably, it's either something called cyclic vomiting syndrome or it's cannabis hyperemesis. And the only way to tell the difference is to stop using cannabis for 3 months. And, if it goes away, it was the cannabis. If it doesn't go away, it's cyclic vomiting, which is really important because they're different treatments. Like you're really never going to stop the vomiting and the overnights in the ER, which are in the hospital, which are awful. If you have cannabis hyperemesis, if you don't modify or stop your cannabis use, ideally stop it. Now, my definition, to get back to an earlier question, of addiction is continued use despite negative consequences. So continued use despite negative consequences. And I've had patients that can't stop their cannabis use for 3 months just to see if that's what's causing them to be in the hospital like several nights a month. And to me, that's addiction. That's like continued use despite negative consequences. If your doctor, who's not obviously anti-cannabis at all, is saying you have to stop just for 3 months and you can't do it, that makes me worried about an addiction. To get to your broader question, when a patient comes in, I use the same calculus as I would for any other patient. What's ailing them? Have we done all the lifestyle things to help them? Do they need a medication? The only difference is I include cannabis in addition. Say they're in pain. There's opiates, there's non-steroidals, your Advil, your ibuprofen, your naproxen. There's Tylenol, which doesn't really do that much. And then I have cannabis. So I feel like I have an extra tool in my toolbox. And I feel like the other doctors, there's been taught nothing about cannabis. They're not taught about, like something like 8% of medical students say they're taught anything about medical marijuana during medical school. And the problem is, like, almost 100% of patients want to talk about it. So you have this situation where the doctors haven't been taught anything. And what little they've been taught isn't even true. They're just still taught some of these drug war myths from the psychiatrists and the US government in the 1970s. And I just think doctors need to know enough about cannabis to have a sensible discussion with a patient. They need to know, sorry, you're pregnant, you can't use it, or sorry, you're 16, we don't recommend it, or sorry, we're in the psychiatric hospital for bipolar last year, we don't recommend it, it might destabilize you. Or to be like, you have chronic pain, why don't we start with a very, modest tincture, mostly CBD, a little bit of THC, try a drop at night, try a couple drops the next night, work your way up slowly. I mean, doctors can do this. And I feel like doctors haven't done a good job of making people feel comfortable and non-judged and not stigmatized. So what happens is that most people don't mention their cannabis use to their doctors. And they go and see a medical cannabis doctor, like me, for example. And there's no communication. It's not in the medical records. The medical cannabis doctor doesn't know the specialist, doesn't know what worked and didn't work in the past. And then the regular doctors don't know that the patient's using cannabis. And it's really important because, number one, there's some medication interactions. For example, CBD works just like grapefruit juice. It can raise the level of other medications in your blood by competing for the liver enzymes that remove it from your blood. So if you're on a blood thinner, your doctor has to know if you're taking something with CBD in it. There's also changes in anesthesia requirements. If you're a heavy cannabis user, you might require more anesthesia. Not a big deal if the anesthesiologist knows about it. Everybody takes different things. But if the anesthesiologist doesn't know about it, it makes anesthesia more dangerous. So again, the lack of communication about cannabis is much more dangerous than the actual cannabis itself.
Right. So what are you doing to train doctors? Are you offering any webinars or workshops?
Well, I wrote my book, which is great for doctors because it goes over all the harms, real and imagined, with the latest science. It goes over all the benefits, real and purported but not substantiated, with all of the science. I speak a lot to physician groups, to psychiatrists or to primary care doctors, and I really, really enjoy doing that. And I'm working on some webinars. I think a webinar, for example, on what is the endocannabinoid system and why is it important would be a very helpful thing because there just isn't a great source. Everybody complains that there's no good sources, but you're absolutely right. I should do more to help alleviate that.
No, I'm telling you, I read your book and it was like, whoa, I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
And it's interesting too, right?
It's very well written. So I'm giving you a big endorsement on that. But if I may switch to your other book for a minute, because we're suffering this huge opioid crisis in the United States, and you yourself fell victim to addiction to opioids. Are you willing to share a little bit about that? Because I think that provides an extra insight into what's happening in our culture.
Absolutely. Now, I wouldn't put get addicted to opiates, ruin your life, recover from addiction, and help other doctors as part of the medical school curriculum. I certainly say it gives you like certain understanding of addiction that you can't possibly have. I mean, on a certain level, people who have never been addicted, and 20 million people are addicted in the US and about 20 million are in recovery from addiction. If you haven't been addicted, you think sort of, why don't you just stop taking drugs? But it's so much more complicated than that.
Right.
I've written extensively about that, about how it takes over your brain and your morality and your thoughts, and you're just trying not to withdraw. But I developed this horrible addiction to prescription painkillers. Now, doctors are very susceptible to this because we have the same stresses that everybody else does, sick parents, sick kids, divorce, bipolar, whatever. And also we have this expectation that we function every day as these flawless robots that just provide care. And we also have to deal with everybody else's problems, which is really, really draining. And then the fourth thing is we are now trying to provide like pretty good care in a system that's in collapse. I mean, it's so exploitative, and nobody's happy with, like, nobody can even find a primary care doctor anymore, let alone get into a specialist. So, and then we have the access to these medications. You know, we have refills, we have a prescription pad, we have samples, people bring in their meds to the office. So that's why I call my book Free Refills. And unfortunately, it culminated. I didn't get help. I thought I had it under control, like most doctors do, Dr. Heal Thyself. And I didn't get help until the state police and the DEA raided my office, which was not a fun day. I would not highly recommend it to anybody. And then I basically, long story short, lost my license for 3.5 years, got it back. And then about 5 years later, the Massachusetts Medical Society, their physician health service, the body of people that helps doctors who are in distress, invited me to be an associate director and to help other doctors with their addiction. So I sat at the same exact table, only on the other side, helping other doctors that had just been caught. And it's one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. And the fact is, people can overcome addictions. It's very difficult. I've written extensively about this. We need to be open-minded about treatments. We need to use the medications that are available. For opiates, we have Suboxone and methadone. They both cause a 50 to 80% reduction in death from overdose. The only problem is, because of our very fragmented medical system, only 20% of people who need Suboxone or methadone actually get it. That's why we're still having 110,000 overdose deaths every year. And also, the recovery community needs to be more open-minded. Enough of the cult-like, and I know that's going to be a big word for you, but the cult-like attitude of Alcoholics Anonymous, where, you know, one is too many, 1,000 is never enough, abstinence for life. And we need to welcome people who are on Suboxone, who are on methadone. We need to welcome people who are using psychedelics for the recovery, which you recently had an excellent show on. We need to welcome people who are using cannabis instead of alcohol or opiates. You know, definitely harm reduction. You're not going to die from the cannabis, even if you're not using it in a great way. So there's a lot of work we could do. But the most important thing is that we need to not give up on people who are addicted. The reason I'm alive and talking to you today is that nobody gave up on me, even though I'd be stealing pills, I'd be lying, I'd be secretive, I'd do all the things that you do when you're addicted that I'm not at all proud of, but I understand now, and I've sort of forgiven myself. But nobody, my friends, my family, my colleagues, nobody gave up on me. And if you have an addicted person in your life, you have to just keep loving them and believing in them. You know, if they're stealing your money, you hide your wallet. If they're breaking in, you could change the locks. You could protect yourself, but don't give up on them. If you take one of these tough love approaches, like, I'm going to let the addict find their bottom, they're going to end up dead. So please don't do that. Just be empathic, be patient, and get them the help that they need.
Yeah, and I'm in awe of your strength, but also your integrity and your desire to help others. And as a survivor of a cult, people say you're uniquely qualified to help others who are in cults. And in terms of, you know, the 12-step program, I just say, if it works for you, great. But if you believe that's the only way you can exist, then you have to walk around always believing you're an addict, even though you haven't used in 30 years, or believe you're powerless. That I have a problem with as a therapist. But if it works for you, great. The community, the being with people who aren't trying to coax you into drinking or whatever, using the drugs. But I've started in my own personal way, trying to encourage you to learn about clinical hypnotherapy as a modality to help people control their own mind and body and deal with some of the underlying aspects that are driving these problematic behaviors. And I hope you take me up on my recommendation and get some clinical training in hypnotherapy, because honestly, there's a lot of people who can't afford the medications, don't have access, but they can learn how to relax their anxiety and their stresses and have positive suggestions and such.
There is good data for hypnotherapy treating addiction, though. A lot of people get hypnotized smoking cigarettes, and it does have a fairly high quit rate. So I'm eager to learn more about that. I suspect my next book is going to have something to do with addiction. And I certainly will make a commitment to learn more about that. I certainly read the books you've given me that are sitting right next to my desk in my house.
Yeah, my listeners probably know that I'm involved with the New England Society for Clinical Hypnosis and the American Society of Hypnosis. And I've recently written 2 chapters for the International Society of Hypnosis textbooks on the dark side of hypnosis, because most destructive cult leaders are using hypnosis and methodology on their followers, and they're oblivious to understanding.
I do have to add that you gave me a bunch of hypnosis tapes, and I'm very grateful. When I was in my very dark days in the hospital about 6 weeks ago, right after getting mowed down by this woman, and I was literally in excruciating pain, and I couldn't sleep, and my roommate was moaning, and I listened to the hypnosis tapes, and they helped me fall asleep. And none of it was so bad that even though they were giving me pretty heavy duty pharmaceuticals, I couldn't sleep. And I think the hypnosis is really what helped me relax enough so that I could just drift off to sleep.
Yeah,
so
and they're
really
clinical hypnotherapists who have recorded tapes and CDs and downloads. Michael Yapko is one of the ones that I shared with you, and you download it. And I believe I have a little iPod Nano. It's out of date, but I use it. And if I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm having trouble with racing thoughts, I put it on and I just go back to sleep. And it's a good tool in the
It seems like
toolbox.
meditation, if you got into the habit of like a daily practice, you'd be a lot less anxious. That's sort of my sense.
Yeah. So I believe in meditation. There are many cults that claim they have the only meditation that works, like TM, which I, really think is a problematic group. But I really just believe in focusing on your breath and doing a diaphragmatic breathing, in through the nose to a count of 4, out through the mouth, pursed lips to a count of 6, and believing the stress is leaving your body with every exhale, and relaxation is coming in with the inhale, and it works for me.
I just did it while you were talking about it, and I feel much more relaxed.
Yeah.
But when you think about
You're just saying that, Peter.
No, I do. It's hard not to feel relaxed when you're doing a breathing exercise. But we have a crisis of anxiety and of loneliness and a huge mental health crisis, combined with the fact that nobody can find a therapist. It's hard to find a psychiatrist. You can't find a primary care doctor. So we're going to have a big need for these modalities that people can do on their own. In a perfect world, they can have access to meditation, hypnosis, all the things you do at home, exercise, but also see a psychiatrist, see their doctor, see a therapist. But the access is getting worse and worse and worse. In my clinic, which is, I work at a really prestigious hospital, there's a 1-year wait list to see a therapist. Like, how does that help to have a 1-year wait list? But that's everywhere. I'm not just, criticizing
No, it's true. No, it's a lot of people are burned out. Doctors are burned out, therapists are burned out, and some have committed suicide because they really burned out and they didn't get the help that they needed. So I'm increasingly just telling people, it's your mind, it's your body. You need to be in charge, and don't look outside for solutions. Figure out how you work and what works for you.
Right. The only problem is people can be working 3 jobs to try to make ends meet. It's hard to find the time and the space to really do that for a lot of people. They're working harder for less, and people are sort of slowly sinking socioeconomically, and our medical system is sort of slowly sinking. So these things are more important than ever, but it's also hard for people to sort of do when they're that stressed out.
Yes, exactly. And I have to mention social media and the fact that people are on their smartphones 8 to 10 hours a day, especially young people, and it's causing them to be anxious and depressed. And it's no substitute, as you were thanking your family and friends for believing in you and supporting you, like having real people in your life that you can sit with, and not just followers on the internet, but like really rich, enriching relationships and friendships.
That's actually a huge component of recovery from addiction. As you get addicted, your emotional connections increasingly become with your drug of choice. For me, it was like snorting, taking Vicodin or snorting oxycodone, and you tune out real relationships. And part of it's how our brain is configured. They say eating a good meal is like 10 units of dopamine, and taking methamphetamines like 1,000 units of dopamine. It's hard for our brain to compete with the normal healthy pleasures of life is really difficult. But a huge part of recovery from addiction is finding a way for like taking a walk in the woods with a friend to become as rewarding again as the oxycodone was. And it happens. It just takes time, and you have to like stay the course and put one foot in front of the other, but your brain goes back to normal. But just when you immediately quit in the first couple months, you just think you're never going to enjoy anything again. It's really difficult. We need to particularly support people in early recovery, because there's always like, you just take the drug and you're back into like euphoric bliss again. It's very difficult to hold the course.
Right. And regarding smartphones and online, like, turn off the phone, take a day off, take a week off, and your brain starts going back to normal if you stop.
I really applaud your including. I tend to focus on the drugs when I talk, and the behavioral addictions can be just as destructive. Sex addiction, the social media, gambling, shopping. I mean, it's just doing something to feel happy when you're not happy that isn't really something that causes happiness. I couldn't agree with you more.
Right. And now the research is saying happiness should not be your goal. Mattering is what really is fulfilling for people long term, and finding purpose in your life. And like, what do I want to do with this amazing opportunity to be alive? And a lot of it's about contributing to others and those relationships that are so critically important.
I'm not a huge fan of the 12 steps, but there is elements of the 12 steps that I fully agree with. And like the 12th step is about helping other people who are addicted to help maintain your own recovery. And I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, I really just feel like whenever I'm unhappy, I try to focus on helping other people. And then I find that I'm thinking about them, and I'm not like sitting on my pity pot, poor me, poor me, poor me. So I couldn't agree with you more. I think helping other people is a great way not only to help other people and make the world a better place, but also to help your own mood and your own sense of self-worth.
Yes, it feels good to help other people. And people say, Steve, I don't know how you've been doing this for 47 years. And it's really not the trolls that call me names. It's the people who say, I read your book, it saved my life, or, I heard a podcast and thank you so much. I had no idea. And that gives me meaning and purpose, and says, there's more people out there that like maybe listening to Peter Grinspoon and realizing, maybe I need to revisit the whole topic of cannabis.
Well, I do want to mention, to sneak in, your book, Combating Mind Control, had a huge influence on me. I'm sure you've heard that from a lot of different people, but I thought I knew about cults. I had no idea. I mean, I knew a little bit more just from being your friend and from us talking about it, but there were a lot of groups that I didn't know were cults, like the Jehovah's Witness. You don't think they're a cult. You don't realize that they treat people really poorly and that they exploit people and control their finances and trap them. I mean, it was so mind-blowing. And it was also mind-blowing, the psychology involved. I just learned a lot of psychology and a lot about cults. I would recommend Combating Mind Control to anybody. I know it's an old book that's been updated several times, but it just seemed like incredibly relevant. And it's going to affect how I act as a primary care doctor, because if I have 1,000 patients, right, that I'm in charge of, tell me that one of them or two of them aren't in a cult. I mean, it's so much more common than I thought. And it's actually something that, the problem is doctors are overwhelmed and they have too many things we're supposed to be looking out for, like tobacco, domestic violence, but drug use. But I think it's really important for doctors to, just like you think doctors should read my book, I actually really think doctors should read your book, Combating Mind Control, because how do we know about it? If nobody teaches us about cults in medical school, they're teaching us about how the kidney works, which is also really important. There's too much to know, but they can't just skip cults, because, I mean, roughly speaking, what percentage of people are in cults? Would you say like 1% or have been?
There's no good data, but I can tell you a psychiatrist friend of mine who worked at McLean, after he took my course, said, Steve, there are 4 people on my inpatient that I never realized were raised in authoritarian cult groups, and that the root of their problems were not the diagnoses, but the root of their problem was
Trauma.
not and the dissociative identity where you're not allowed to be yourself, or it's homophobic or whatever. And I just want to come back to Jehovah's Witnesses. They had a huge pedophilia issue. They had a list of over 35,000 pedophiles that they didn't turn over to the police, and they permitted to continue to abuse other children. But as a doctor, doctors need to know their whole belief system around no blood transfusions was a made-up thing.
Really?
That had nothing to do with the founder. And tens of thousands of people have died for no reason except that they were told they're going to, be kicked out of the group, and God will, judge them forever if they take a blood transfusion.
Well, funny that you say that, because about 10 years ago, I had a patient. He's no longer alive, but he was a Jehovah's Witness, and he had Crohn's disease, and he needed surgery. And he asked me to find him a surgeon that would guarantee that he would not give him a blood transfusion during surgery. And I wish I had known you back then, about 10 years ago, but I can absolutely guarantee no surgeon in their right mind would make that commitment.
Right.
The patient's bleeding out because you hit the wrong artery and just bad luck. You need to transfuse them. So I just said to him, I can ask around, but I can absolutely guarantee that there's no surgeon that's going to agree, because you're a Jehovah's Witness, to do surgery, but to not give you a transfusion if you're bleeding to death. Right. And it's interesting to hear you say that's so sad. That's not even part of their doctrine.
It is part of their doctrine now, but it wasn't their original doctrine. And and they keep changing it a little bit. They can have blood parts of this type or that part, but the bottom line is they're ignoring science.
Well, the practical factor is, like, I'd never convinced my patient of this. I could tell him this until he's blue in the face, and he'd still hold on to his beliefs, was a feeling that I got.
Well, but then that's where, and again, everybody's overworked and there's no time, but there are former JWs who understand, who could be brought in. One would need to find out if the group is visiting them in the hospital, and the bottom line is there are people who have watched and allowed their own children die from a car accident where they bled to death. Then they wake up and get out of the cult and realize that it's not God's only truth, and their Bible doesn't actually hold any, scholarly value. And they feel guilty the rest of their life that they let their child die for no reason.
Awful. But one thing that was interesting about this patient is that I did suggest medical marijuana. And he's like, I don't know what the Jehovah's Witnesses, if they allow that. So we actually asked the elders, and they said, sure, no problem. Then he started using it. And he said, hey, for the first time when I was driving, I could look to the left and look to the right. And I'm like, how have you been driving all these years?
Right.
But it was interesting that he asked his elders, and they actually were open to medical marijuana. I was really surprised. I don't know why, but I thought. I'm surprised.
Never heard that one before.
Yeah,
I'll have
but
to
wouldn't you
check
expect them to kind of say no if they don't allow blood transfusions?
Yeah, I don't. So the bottom line is there's so many people exiting the Watchtower now, and former high up people as well, and that's my excitement, is that that people are reclaiming their power, exiting, and then wanting to help their loved ones who are still in the group, because they have a very heavy shunning, disfellowshipping practice where people are not allowed to talk to their own children or their own parents or their own siblings if they're, kicked out of the group because they don't obey the rules of the governing body. But coming back to your incredible book, Seeing Through the Smoke, a cannabis specialist untangles the truth about marijuana.
One, two.
We got it on both screens. As we're beginning to wrap up, maybe you can summarize some of your takeaways, and maybe someone from a government administration somewhere around the world will be listening to this. What do you want to say to them too?
Sure. Well, the takeaway is that we all need to sort of look at marijuana from scratch. We all have these strong opinions about it because it's been at the front and center of the culture war for the last half century. And, the people who are against it just won't believe in any of the benefits. They still put medical marijuana in these derogatory quotation marks, even though there are like 4 million medical marijuana patients in this country who are doing well, and many, many more, as we discussed, who are using it medically, but aren't official medical marijuana patients that you could track. The pro-cannabis people, whenever there's a study that says, this causes this potential harm, they say, oh, the government's lying, because the government did lie for so many years about cannabis, which I document in my book. But if you use marijuana, you should want to know the harms, right? I'm not a big drinker, but I know the harms of alcohol. So, and then I still might have a beer at a barbecue, but I make an informed decision. So I just think the anti-people need to learn more about the pros with an open mind, and the pro people need to know more about the harms. So that's why I very meticulously went through all of the potential harms and all of the potential benefits and said, what does the science say? Let's look at cancer, right? Cannabis does not cure cancer. If you have cancer, you see an oncologist, and you use the cannabis for the pain, the anxiety, the nausea, the weight loss. In cells, certain components of cannabis, the minor cannabinoids, kill cancer cells. But that doesn't mean it kills cancer in humans. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years from now they develop cannabis-based drugs that are chemotherapeutic. But right now, there's no evidence that cannabis cures cancer. So I think the anti-people need to understand that cannabis can be just quality of life saving, not life saving, but quality of life saving for people suffering with cancer, and that the pro-cannabis people need to see an oncologist, not use these huge doses of what's called Rick Simpson oil to try to cure their cancer. If you have cancer, you see an oncologist. So I just think both sides need some humility, and we need to take this time where we're legalizing it to kind of reevaluate it and just try to have a less polarized, less emotionally charged, more neutral and more sort of accepting attitude towards it. I mean, if people are going to use it anyways, obviously, why criminalize it?
Great. So I'm sure you're recommending more research and more public health information delivering in med schools, as well as for, in the field of psychiatry.
Absolutely. But again, it has to be true information that they're disseminating, right? It didn't help when we had the DARE program. I mean, I keep going back to that, but you just blew your credibility with teenagers. And once you blow your credibility with a teenager, good luck getting it back. You'll maybe 30 years later. So we need to actually tell the truth, but there are harms and there are benefits, and both are equally as important. And again, I just think we're at a critical point where 94% of Americans think that cannabis, people should have legal access to medical marijuana, but then the doctors know so little about it, they can't have a sensible discussion. So the main takeaway is we need more education across the board, and that we need to come to I truly think there's some middle ground that we could come to. I think we could all agree that cannabis helps people with anxiety, insomnia, and chronic pain. There are a lot of psychiatrists that don't agree with that, but they're flat out wrong. We can agree that cannabis shouldn't be used by teens unless, whatever, they're dying of cancer, shouldn't be used by pregnant women or breastfeeding women unless whatever else they'd be using would be more dangerous, and shouldn't be used or should be used with extreme caution in people with a history or a family history of psychosis like schizophrenia. There is common ground that we could all agree upon. You wouldn't know it from how polarized the debate is. And I think as the science comes in, we could just expand this common ground and all move forward together.
And your website is?
www.petergrinspoon.com. It's grin like smile, spoon like fork.
I haven't heard that one before.
Well, people mangle my name so much that my dad came up with that.
That's really funny. Well, it's such a pleasure becoming a friend and sharing stories, and thank you for agreeing to do this, and a speedy further recovery from your car accident. I'm very grateful.
I'm grateful too. It could have all been over. And I very much enjoyed this conversation. And I enjoy all of our conversations, and I look forward to the next one.
Yeah. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Steve Hassan here. It's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.